Good afternoon from Paris, and welcome to a session of the Paris Peace Forum on risk control, better governing climate risks for people and the planet. Always important to get both the P's in, people and the planet. My name's Oliver Morton. I'm fresh off 8 hours of train journey from Glasgow in Scotland, where I was at COP26. I'm a senior editor at The Economist. I'm also the author of a book that's relevant to this subject called The Planet Remade. And I am also the trustee of an NGO called the Degrees Initiative, which works in the area of global South research in climate engineering. I'm here to moderate the panel and to give you a sense of what we're talking about. Having come from Glasgow, one's struck with the need to focus on the next few years, the next decade, this critical decade that we're in. But we also always need to remember that climate change is a problem of stocks, not of flows, and the risks that the world faces depend on the cumulative amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, not on what we do next week or next year or in the next 10 years, though those things matter. The driver is the cumulative stock. And that means that even in a world where mitigation is taken seriously, we're looking at still running significant, maybe more than that, risks of moving over the 1.5 target, which was the subject of the IPCC report just a couple of years ago. And so in the understanding of that, what the panel that I'm convening today, moderating today, is hoping to do is talk about how to govern risks in that period of potential overshoot. And I think one of the things that we'd probably all agree on is that it's very important to start that process before the overshoot happens. There's a lag, there's an inertia in moving something as massive as a planet, as a world. And so if you don't stop to think about how to govern the risks until the risks are with you, you have absolutely failed in your duty to try and take this problem seriously. So on that basis, I'd like to introduce the panelists, who I imagine will turn up in a gallery format on this screen. And there indeed they are. How lovely to see you all. To introduce Aranava Ghosh, Laurence Tubiana, Veronica Scotti, and Pascal Lamy, who are distinguished panelists tonight. And I'm going to, this afternoon, I'm going to start off actually by asking Laurence, who's been paying even more attention than the rest of us to what's going on in Glasgow. What is the current state of play with respect to the issues that we're talking about here, the issues of the long-term committed change?
Thank you, Oliver, and happy to be there. I think that there was two interesting things in Glasgow discussed. One, of course, the dominance of the net zero by 2050 discourse and commitments, and the anxiety because this was not backed by substantive plans to get there. And on the other side, of course, the acceleration of action in the next 10 years, in particular, focusing on the gap between the actual NDCs presented, even with some improvement, of course, made already at Glasgow, and so for that reason, the necessity to have a new wave of commitments on the climate plans by next year. So the anxiety about the decade is there. Of course, the COP is not closed still. There was a big battles, of course, from in particular the oil exporting companies about this mitigation and in a way with more sense of gravity on the 1.5 degrees than before. So there is a big fight around that. I do think that there was a very interesting discussion in particular, which is, of course, around this panel, which was, what do we do with the overshoot? And in the beginning, and it's funny to see that in the text, 1.5 was meant to be 2,100, and of course with a clear implication of the overshoot. And that has been, of course, a big battle to take it away. It's away now, it will not come back. But so the credibility of the net zero, the effectiveness on the ratchet up mechanism starting next year, it's interesting, of course, to see that more and more countries have to declare how they will absorb potentially extract carbon from the atmosphere or respond to, of course, the gap we have because what is planned for 2030 and where we should be again by 2030. So it is long term and it is short term too, Oliver, and that's a very interesting conversation. Again, and just to finish that, the IEA scenario for 1.5, even of course, is very drastic measures, as you know, stop the exploration on oil and gas, etc. But there is an element of a lot of CCS built in this modeling even. So a pretty comprehensive discussion from the 10th for last year. So again, it's this overshoot is just now. It's a discussion we have already now.
And when you mentioned the speeding up of the NDCs, is that something that you expect to make it through into the final decision document?
Yes, this one, yes. I think it's now.
Strike you as its role as a crucial goal in the climate discourse?
Oliver, of course, it's a crucial goal, but the question is twofold, at least in my mind. One is, who swallows up the carbon space for 1.5, and the second is, what if we don't stay within 1.5? And that's the overshoot conversation you and I have had for nearly a decade. Now, even with the net zero targets, for instance, from China, United States, and European Union, our estimation at CEW is they'll consume 90% of the remaining carbon space for 1.5. So if they shifted their net zero dates by 10 years, so EU and the US come to 2040 and China comes to 2050, they open up 113 gigatons of carbon dioxide space for other countries while keeping to within a 1.5 story. So 1.5 is critical for the planet, but it's also critical for equity. The other question then is, what if we don't stay within 1.5, right? And if we overshoot? And this is where what Lawrence was saying is absolutely critical. Because if we model our emissions based on the fact that we will overshoot and then suddenly there'll be a magic bullet that will bring it down to net zero, that is really not the message that we should be sending out. And I think at least many of us have been arguing for a much more stringent focus on what happens in the near term rather than just what happens 30 or 40 or 50 years from now, because that overshoot is something that we haven't actually figured out what we do with it. Because do you then geoengineer the climate? Do you come up with CCS? Do you come up with CDR of other kinds, the carbon dioxide removal of other kinds? None of this is proven. Even the net zero modeling that we've done at CEW for India, there's a huge difference between whether you have CCS or you don't have CCS, right? So ultimately, what will really matter is what you do within the next 9 years. At least it will set the direction of travel very differently than what we've experienced, at least for the last 30 years since the FCCC was negotiated.
Do you worry, Aaron, in yourself about the contrast between the need to be prepared for worse outcomes and the need to work, as you say, very stringently for those next 10 years? Because at some point, then, surely there's a need for a preparedness. You must plan for the work for the best and plan for the worst. How do you make that trade-off within your own thinking on this subject?
Well, I at least don't make a trade-off. In fact, I think it has been unfortunate in the negotiations that we have ignored the issue of adaptation and resilience in the hope that, repeated failure to mitigate would result in better efforts at mitigation. In my head, the need for mitigation is absolutely critical. And yet I operate, at least in terms of the kind of research I do or my colleagues do, we operate on preparing for the worst, which is why we are developing the first high-resolution climate risk atlas for India, the first of its kind in the developing world, at a 25-kilometer resolution. And the climate vulnerability index that we released just 2 weeks ago shows that 463 out of India's 700 odd districts are already highly climate vulnerable, which is a combination of the exposure to the natural event, but also the sensitivity of the communities living there and the administrative capacity to respond. If we don't start doubling down on building that local capacity to respond to super shocks here and now, but also build in the resilience in the hard and soft infrastructure, we will be, the pandemic would only be a little pinprick compared to what will come and hit us.
So when you say that, do you mean that those, I think you said 476 districts are already climate vulnerable or are vulnerable to a changed climate? You're saying they're vulnerable to today's climate, yes?
They're vulnerable. So 3/4 of our districts are already hotspots for extreme climate events, which means that the intensity and frequency of extreme events over the last half century have increased in 75% of our districts. But when we look at vulnerability, we're also factoring in not just the occurrence of the event, but the sensitivity of the local community, the kind of economic structures that are present there to be able to withstand those shocks, and the administrative capacity. We are meant to have national, state, and district disaster management plans. Now, how robust are those plans? How robustly can the administrative structures at a very local level be able to respond? A storm surge or a cyclone hits Mumbai, one of the richest cities in the world, very different from the same cyclone hitting just 90 kilometers south in a fishing village, right? So you need to be able to have that hyper-local analysis and hyper-local administrative capacity to respond. That's how we are calculating vulnerability.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. Veronica, I imagine you have a slightly different, but also quite high level of concern about such vulnerability coming from the reinsurance industry.
Yeah, well, hi, Oliver, and thank you for having me. I actually fully concur with what was just said, that vulnerability is not just being exposed to an event, but also your ability to respond to it. So this resilience concept is really important. Maybe I just share a few thoughts about our perspective on what has happened at COP. So I think, first of all, we do see mobilization, but we see the strongest mobilization is actually happening in the private sector at this point in time. As you know, over 500 companies have already signed to science-based targets. And of these, 114 actually have come together in this past year very strongly as part of a climate leader coalition facilitated by the WEF. And Oliver, to your question about what is happening in the next 10 years, and that sets very much the scene for what will happen between now and the end of the century. The coalition has put forward 3 very critical recommendations. So the areas where we believe interventions need to happen in order to accelerate the ability of the private sector to meet its 2050 net zero targets. And I just want to share them very quickly because I think it sets the scene of what, in terms of what needs to happen. So first of all, it's around pricing mechanisms. So it's about eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, reducing or cutting altogether tariffs for climate-friendly goods, and developing markets that fundamentally broadly embed and accept the carbon pricing mechanisms, which is not the case today. These are conditions necessary to help with a just transition, and we need to put in place ex ante this reflection about the just transition, because people will be affected very, very severely if the transition is not orderly. The second thing is where you were hinting before. We really need to help across various value chains to help all the first movers that can allow the development of proven technologies where they exist. That is particularly the case in the hard to abate sectors where they can do more with deploying the technologies that they have, but also developing completely new technologies. And you were referring to direct air capture or geoengineering. I think it's very important for that scaling up to happen, that we put in place today as quickly as possible effective and harmonized laws and regulations, and that the public procurement processes are tilted towards low carbon providers, low carbon products, low carbon analysis of value chains. So that's to me the second most critical step to really accelerate and deliver what we've promised on. And thirdly, I do concur that climate adaptation is going to be a necessity. That is in, as we just heard, resilient cities, but also in supply chains and infrastructure, all of which at the moment are not set up to be ready for climate event defense. And obviously scaling up, I believe, also risk transfer solutions. And the reason why this is important is not just about the physical aspect of being ready for these risks, but also accepting that our food systems and our water supplies are going to be very much under stress in the next decade. And so having this preparedness in mind is essential. By the way, I think it's a very well-known fact that we're not trending towards the 1.5, rather 2.6. And our scenarios project even 3.2. So, and under that scenario, the world looks very, very different.
Pascal, if I can turn to you to take a broader look, pulling us back a little bit from COP26, how do you see the issue of planning for risks that one's desperately trying not to actually face?
Thanks, Oliver, and let me sort of personally thank you for having brought this overshoot issue on the table for quite a long time, and I'm happy that it's now taken more seriously than when you started, and that's probably credit to you. If I look at the broad picture, let's come back to simple things. Whatever probability we associate to overshooting 1.5, we have to know that the problem is not the probability. The problem is the multiple of probability and impact. Something with a low probability, which has a huge impact, is something very important. And it's all the more important in the case of climate that the impact is disproportionate and that it hits more the weak than the strong. So there is a probability to overshoot 1.5. Whatever it is it 10%, 50%, 60%, the impact will be absolutely enormous. So we need to look at that now. And I think Laurence and Arun have given the two reasons why we need to look at that now. Laurence said it's going to be the next 10 years that will really matter, and I believe she's right. And Arun Nadba said there are negative emission technologies, but none of this is proven. And that's absolutely correct. So the logical conclusion of what Laurence, of what you've said, Oliver, what Laurence has said, and what Arun have said, and I add to that what we just heard from Swiss Re, is that we now need to look into this overshoot scenario and to look seriously at how negative emissions could be addressed, whether the technologies that are floated here and there make sense. We need a deep dive into this scenario, and I think it's time to do it now.
That's stirring out, and that I'm very grateful for your kind words. I'd actually like to bring that back to Arun, because you talked about in your opening remarks, you talked about the concept of carbon space, which is a concept that India has talked about for a long time, and I think the rest of the world has slowly caught up to. And you also talked about the unproven technologies for negative emissions. I wonder about the unproven politics of negative emissions. How different does the world become if carbon space becomes, as it were, unshackled, if it becomes something that's floating in space and time because it can be expanded by taking carbon out of the atmosphere, just as it can be reduced by putting carbon into the atmosphere? Is that as it were, sort of like a second order effect of the way we already are, or does that completely, to your mind, change the way the politics might come to matter?
It will completely change the politics because, The reason we've not discussed adaptation and resilience, for instance, as much as we've discussed mitigation is because countries until now have largely stuck to this assumption that we will not breach the planetary limits. And therefore it's, let's keep doing it, let's keep mitigating and hope to stay within those limits. We are now, as everyone on this panel has said, we are well on track of breaching those limits. Now, the politics could change, just before we breach it, at the point of breaching, or after. But the point is, without the governance of an overshoot, you're in for a free-for-all, right? And that free-for-all can take many different forms. It can take, as you're saying, the introduction of technologies that have not entirely been proven, to see, well, now can I create more carbon space for myself or for others by sucking carbon out of the atmosphere? Or I realize that these technologies are not as effective as I had expected, or not as cost effective as I had hoped. And then there is a scramble for what is not left at all. So this is a crisis, a political crisis that the world has never actually handled before. If you think the next year we're going to have Stockholm plus 50, what was Stockholm 1972 all about? It was about scarcity. We were thinking we were at the limits of growth, that resources were running out, food was going to run out. 50 years later, humanity is in a place of abundance where we've followed such a rapacious approach to development that we think we can suck resources out of everything, out of land, out of water, out of the air. And that has driven us to this level of excessive consumption and unbridled, unsustainable growth that we now are wondering what is going to be the political arrangement that prepares a generation that only knows abundance for scarcity.
Laurence, do you think that? I think that's a terrific way of framing it, actually. And I want to ask Laurence, this idea that everything is in abundance except carbon space, and that is the one hard limit that so far the world has not been able to make any more of. Do you find that a useful frame for looking at these issues, the idea that we're just running out of room and need to either stop or create more room, or both?
I think it's now a discussion. We started the carbon budget discussion very early on in 1997 in Kyoto first, in a way, agreement on the Kyoto Protocol. This has not led, of course, to very, very good conclusions. That's why in the Paris Agreement we had to accept that it is about this ratchet mechanism that countries base the bottom-up climate plans that respect their full sovereignty. So this led to the impasse in which we are now, of course. On the other side, when you look at the planet boundaries, and I'm very struck by what Aruna says, we haven't shifted, we are not shifting even for our CO2 world, decarbonized world, we are not shifting out of the extractive model, and that's a problem. When you look at how we envisage electrified transport, we suppose a lot of more mining, with conditions that for the moment are particularly in everywhere very, very bad. So we are not shifting to another model of relation between the economic model and the nature and the ecosystem in which we are living, even if we don't consider that is a reality. So that's probably the problem, and I think Aruna is right. And that's why adaptation was so complex to put in our discussion, because we were too focused on CO2 tons, where in reality the ecosystem in general we are ruining. So in my view, even if it's very difficult to grab, this planet boundaries concept is probably the most serious one, because we are touching many, many resources, and we are switching from one resource, fossil fuel, to another one, which would be, the cobalt, the lithium, or something else, or space, by the way, for renewable energy systems. So the notion that the budget of resources, something we should have a much less footprint, is, on my view, essential. How we lessen that footprint is in my view central, But that revolution in the economic, in the financial systems, that when I was just get out of Glasgow this morning, and people are very far from there. They are still sticking to the past with all their strengths. That's why this question of overshoot and what we can do and how at least we have to establish anyway a new set of governance, not only on these new technologies, non-proven technologies, but as well on the seriousness of every effort is for me a condition. So I would say let's try to be more broad into the way we think about extractivism, because if not, we will fall from a problem to another one.
Veronica, I'm intrigued by the idea that one of the things that happens to extractive industries is that in the medium term, maybe in the short term, it becomes very hard for them to actually insure their businesses. Is that something that you expect to see come about through the insurance markets?
Yeah, and I think the point that Laurence just made goes over and beyond, what you may think of coal and mining. It's just the relationship between economic activities and nature. So the extractive concept is it's something that we have been dependent. So let me maybe share statistics. As a company, we actually look at biodiversity as integral and if you will, the other side of the coin of climate change. And we know that 55% of the world GDP depends on a healthy state of biodiversity and ecosystems. So, but about these ecosystems are actually at very high risk of loss of biodiversity. About 20% in some countries is much more critical than that. So it's not just about the extractive nature of mining or coal or oil and gas, etc., but it is actually across all sectors of the economy. And so recognizing that we benefit a lot, but as was said before, we are at the limit of the natural capital boundaries of absorption of our activities. It's a fundamental shift that we need to make. And it's one of the principles that we embed in the way we underwrite. So to address your question specifically, we do believe, let me share maybe a couple of considerations. First of all, natural catastrophes are at this point heavily underinsured. 75% are not insured today. To put in the people context which you opened up with, that means about 4 billion people at this point in time are not properly protected by their governments in the case of a natural catastrophe. And the key driver of natural catastrophes, if you look over the last few years, is actually climate change related perils. So this year to date, we're looking at 94 billion and counting, right? The season is not over. And it's the fourth in our record history. And most of it is related to hurricanes and floods, which are very much climate perils. So obviously, it was said before, the point of vulnerability is not just about an event happening, it's very much got to do with the weak infrastructure, so the preparedness of our physical assets. But what this also means is that as we introduce mechanisms that recognize more the carbon footprint, we're going to look at the way we value assets very differently. And so the extractive industries that you were referring to, the carbon-heavy industries, are bound to see about 70% of their assets getting stranded. That's fundamental. That's our 70% of their losses of revenues. If we were to introduce a carbon tax that is aligned with what the IMF suggests is in the range of $75 to $80 per ton, that's a big shock. That doesn't mean that the industry have to disappear. They can find ways, if they embrace seriously transition, and that's what we would like to suggest, right, that they get very serious about their transition, they stand to gain from it, because what is fundamentally required is a very rapid shift of the energy sources. And for that, we need predictability. We need an environment where public and private collaboration exists, so that governments set those long-term incentives for these industry leaders to make a shift in their economic activities to something that is, as was said before, a fundamentally much lower carbon footprint. From an insurance, and I'll just finish with this final thought because I think you asked me about what is insurance doing. From an insurance industry perspective, we've definitely embraced Swiss Re, but not only, many others as well. We very much embraced the principle of carbon footprinting of all of our activities. So Swiss Re did that already in 2017 for its assets, its investment assets, and we've been ESG benchmarking ever since, and divesting of across all sectors from the highest polluters, if you will. So, or if you flip more positively, we invest in the top quintile of companies that we think are doing the right things, and we're doing exactly the same now in our underwriting activities. That's a more complicated process, but we have committed to fully decarbonize by 2050, and so you will see us exiting thermal coals, for instance, by 2030 and 2040. Depending on OECD or non-OECD countries. And that's a trend that the entire industry is moving towards.
And that's very encouraging. Pascal, I wanted to actually bring back part of what Laurence was saying to you, which is, there seems to me, and I don't think, I suppose I could be accused of vulgar Marxism, but there's a cultural superstructure and there's a technological infrastructure. And it sounds to me as though when I hear Laurence talking about moving out of extractive models, it's almost as though we have to have the new mindset before we have the new capacity to put that mindset into action. And I wonder whether that's one of the ways that you think about the overshoot, the idea of this mismatch between the way people think and the way the world actually is.
Well, let me give you, Oliver, a typical Marxist response. It's a question of the dialectic between the mental superstructure and the governance systems and the infrastructures of technology. So we have to work on both sides because they are in a historical dialectic relationship. And I think what was just said is absolutely evident on this. It's true that climate is something Marx had not spotted, but since a part of what he said is absolutely applicable. So the conclusion of what was open from this conversation, which is, is there any way we can reshuffle a bit of this carbon space, obliges us to look at negative emissions. And this is a place where, of course, there is room for nature-based solutions, and we know that, carbon sinks, forests, ocean, and so on, but there is a technological toolbox, which we need to explore, whether it is carbon capture, for instance, whether it is even more debated technologies like geoengineering. I believe that we now need to investigate these various ways of assessing, addressing the risks of overshooting. And for this reason, and this conversation incredibly fits with what we heard, the few of us at the Paris Peace Forum who are working on these major climate issues, which led us to one conclusion, which will be one of the conclusions of this year's Paris Peace Forum edition, which is to put together, under the auspices of the Paris Peace Forum, a global commission on reducing the risks from climate overshoot. So this is going to be done in a sort of self-dependent.
Pascal, I think we're losing your voice slightly.
I'm sorry about that. Is it okay now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, sounds better now. Yeah.
So we are in the process of putting together such a body, the mission of which would be to look into adaptation, mitigation, and technologies that seem to be fit for purpose for negative emissions, and which, of course, and that's the point which Laurence mentioned, will need a proper, whatever assessment is done of their doability, their feasibility, their cost to efficiency ratio, will need a proper governance setup. So we need to add to what exists in climate governance, in the sort of decarb national collective roadmaps, something that addresses this question. And we will put this together in the months to come, and hopefully that gather enough expertise, work, views, and recommendations for COP28. I wouldn't say COP27 because I don't think such a body will be ready by then, but for COP28.
If I may.
I'm sorry, did someone try to make a point there? I didn't quite hear.
Yeah, that's me, Laurence. Yeah, because we are coming from Glasgow, even if it's still, again, just in many hurdles. We have made, many of us has made many points going to Glasgow on the risk of greenwashing, and that all these net zero commitments were not backed by anything serious. And then in particular, because there was so much attention given to all these sectoral initiatives, voluntary commitment, etc. So Antonio Guterres want to set up something that could fit very well, Pascal, with, in a way, the overshoot specifics, because he wants to assure that at least for the mitigation plans that are not, of course, the parties of the Paris Agreement, but all who are saying they are aligned with Paris, some kind of accountability mechanism has to be set up. And that group will deliver its conclusion in 2022. But I think it's very good that we align the seriousness of the commitments on this decade and, of course, for 2050 with what kind of emission reduction plan people really have and how they can displace them. And then if your commission advance on again, avoiding the overshoot and all the solution, then the question of how much we have to deal with that is clear and in a way framed by, because we have even on adaptation, that was Aruna say, if we rely only on mitigation, we are losing time, and it's not possible, as Véronique said. So we need to have all pieces running in parallel and cross-cutting references, and particularly on the governance space, which of course is the one I am more competent with. So I think it's really good to just signal that. I think Guterres will launch that in December or January, I don't know. But at least there is this feeling that we cannot just continue with just announcement, which in a way reduce in reality the carbon space that Aruna was talking about.
Oh no, but I was interested when Patrick was talking there that you've thought quite a lot. I mean, we've talked before about geoengineering, about solar geoengineering rather than carbon geoengineering. So about actually trying to change the amount of sunlight absorbed by the Earth. Do you think that's a conversation the world is in some ways more ready for now than it was in the past? Is that something that makes this commission well timed, or is it still something that most people consider fundamentally unthinkable?
I think the conversation has obviously moved well beyond, the very, very close room conversations you and I have been party to, for a decade. Just yesterday, a co-authored paper of mine came out in a science journal on the need for more social science research to govern solar geoengineering. And I am also authoring something that hopefully will feed into the UNEA 5 process next year. I think we need to, Laurence was just mentioning the word governance. I think we need to very quickly have a much more public discussion about the governance of whether it's solar geoengineering or carbon geoengineering, because in the absence of that, we are again relying on one of two extremes. Either we allow natural scientists to do what they need to or want to do within laboratories or out in the field, or we assume that existing regimes, international regimes, will automatically be able to govern these, highly uncertain technologies. Both those assumptions are actually laden with a lot of value propositions that are not entirely or explicitly acknowledged, and certainly not consensually decided. So I think we need to have a much more public conversation. I've been, in fact, in conversations with the Paris Peace Forum on this subject for at least a year now, and hopefully we can make some progress on this matter. But the other point I wanted to make, and this came up also in what Lawrence and I think Veronica were mentioning, about accountability, right? So if, say, the UNFCCC has failed to hold everyone accountable, what is our answer? Is our answer that, well, we will keep going back to the UNFCCC to establish accountability? In part, the answer is yes. But in part, no. We have to look for other ways to establish accountability. We need other governance mechanisms.
Yeah.
The insurance companies are one. If they are going to say, well, I'm not going to insure what you're going to do, the asset you're going to deploy, and I'm certainly not going to reinsure it, 10 years from now, then that is one form of establishing accountability. Boardrooms are another way. Shareholders are a third way. Civil society is a fourth way. The courts are a fifth way. National parliaments are a sixth way. I think we need to start thinking about climate accountability, and within that, a subset of geoengineering accountability through many different routes of governance. And we are in a world of a regime complex of climate governance, except that we keep going back to one forum and hinge all our bets on 2 weeks out of 52 weeks in the year. What happens in the rest of the 50 weeks will matter a lot more, I believe, going into 2022.
Pascal, how would you see accountability featuring in the sort of work that you imagine this commission doing? And in a linked question, how open to and responsive to public debate and civil society do you imagine being?
Well, I think we live in 2021, so there's no way such a body, which will be self-designed, i.e. with no specific other legitimacy than the collective work they embark on, has not only to be to integrate experts, specialists of governance, of climate, of these sophisticated technologies, but also NGOs, activists, and there's no way, in my view, that a body of this kind, which we are in the process of setting up, will be able to table recommendations without having, in the course of the discussions, properly factored in reactions. And we know that these topics, for some of them, can be very contentious. This is one more reason to air them and to associate non-technical, non-expert parties to such a discussion.
And Veronica, I was interested when Aaron Albert was listing this impressive array of different mechanisms of accountability that operate, as he was saying, 52-52, not 252. What's the thinking on accountability in the CEO forum that you were talking about that's been developed by the WEF? How do companies that are part of that, what holds them accountable?
Well, so various things. So first of all, the commitments are binding. So I understand that there is a fair amount of healthy skepticisms, but actually for us, this is not dependent to the individual CEO that at this point in time has signed. Secondly, let's take the example of financial services, which I'm, a representative of. We are members of the Task Force for Climate Disclosure, and we've been reporting and will continue to be reporting from this point onwards, I think, until it will be part and parcel of how we assess ourselves. And this is becoming integrated in regulatory frameworks. So By the way, we're also members of the Task Force for Nature Climate Disclosure. So I think it's important that we, again, as I said earlier, that biodiversity gets in the fold, and it's going to be even a bigger wave than climate risk. But Oliver, my fundamental answer is yes, it is fantastic to have super bodies that will harmonize and help us see things through. But I think market level mechanisms need to be activated very promptly and have already been activated. So we don't have to invent necessarily a new governance. We have to put the conversation on the table. And so absolutely shareholders are very attentive, and they do show up in meetings and ask questions, and so does the board. And so that transparency in reporting is very much increasing. The risk metrics are getting harmonized. This is incredibly powerful because with the action group that I mentioned before, we have now across sectors a lot of see-through. So as a company, we say we would love to have an orderly transition. It's important for the economy, it's important for people, it's actually important for financial markets as well. So, but that means that the companies that are part of the task force have to disclose to us how they're going to do that transition. And we hold each other accountable to make it happen. And if they can't prove that they're truly committed and they're changing their operation year on year, they cannot be part of that initiative. So it's not just a charming group of people that are, sharing what they've done already in their disclosure, but they are actually binding each other to deliver on those targets, 3-5 years at a time. Maybe the only other point that I want to share with this group is I don't think it's fair to put the question between do we need carbon removal or do we need to reduce the footprint. We need to do both. As a company, we've committed to have our footprint by 2030. It is not a non-negotiable. So to the point of scarcity that you were driving before, we have to absolutely reduce the absolute footprint. Each and every one of us, and as organizations, we have a special responsibility. And then we need to get to net zero. We have to accept that certain sectors will not be able to get there by themselves. So they're always going to be a little bit net positive. Some of them are going to be a lot net positive. And for that, we need the carbon removal markets to really scale up. Swiss Re entered a 10-year contract with Climeworks, which is one of the direct air capture companies, paying a price that people think it's irresponsible. But the reality is someone has got to give market signal. Someone needs to say, I'm willing to finance this technology 10 years out, and I'm going to be buying their net credit, the net carbon credits, so that I can offset my footprint. But the first step is reducing our own direct footprint. Otherwise, we're never going to get out of this. And the net zero credit is needed fundamentally for sectors that are very hard to abate. And to your earlier point, Oliver, to take the net stock in the atmosphere down, because we already have legacy. And thirdly, let's not forget, nature itself emits. There will be wildfires, there will be events, and nature cannot pay for this. We have to pay for it.
Yes, I don't think we're going to get much luck out of sending that particular bill to nature. In the interest of openness to the process, I'd like to ask for any questions from the floor, and we already have one that's come in electronically. I'm afraid I have a little difficulty with this system, but bear with me. We have one question, which I think interesting. Would a human retreat from critical places, and I suspect you can define that as you will, be a useful mechanism of letting the planet recover? In terms of, is one of the things to do with an overshoot to actually just retreat? It's an interesting idea. I don't know who'd like to go for it. I heard a hem.
Yeah, I can give it a try. I think it's a very interesting reflection. We see now in several countries the idea of rewilding places, and in a way, and then rethinking totally the land management and the way we are living in our cities, and in a way the urban sprawl. I think it's very interesting as a reflection that in the infrastructure planning, this notion of retreat is incorporated. And I think it's absolutely possible. There are architects that are proposing models of livable cities, which are really giving much more space to nature. So that's one side. Ocean is another, but Pascal knows that better than anybody else. Ocean is a central piece of the retreat we should be careful of. So I think this is, for me anyway, a sign. And it's interesting, this question to combine with a reflection of the more active, carbon capture. I like the idea.
I was intrigued, though. I mean, there's a concept that's occasionally used of sacrificial zones. I mean, what do you retreat from, and who makes the decision about who gets to retreat or who gets to be, as it were, retreated instead? Pascal, you might want to comment on that.
Well, I mean, we've just had a sort of live experience of what retreating can mean. Not that we decided it, but a virus pushed us to decide it. So I think we have now a solid experience of what retreating means. I'm not sure this is what the advocates of such a new way of living have in mind. But like Laurence, I think it's, let's say, as a sort of utopian approach, as a sort of artistic, mental approach, it's a good way to understand that there are two sides. The one that is in our industries, in our economy, in our technology, and that we can, again, dig, exploit better, look at the various consequences of this, and then the one which lies in our head, the one that lies in our capacity to imagine something different than just retreating from fossil fuels. And I like the notion. I mean, I take it as a sort of, again, as sort of like an artistic thing, something that you see, you feel, and suddenly it takes you to thinking otherwise. I like it.
Aranava?
I mean, I live in the southern part of the National Capital Region in Delhi, where about a decade ago, as the city was expanding, this old stone quarry was about to be demolished or was going to be taken over by builders, and new apartment blocks were going to come up. And an NGO was formed. That my area is called Gurgaon. So an NGO was formed called I Am Gurgaon. And that NGO basically lobbied for just letting that land be. It's prime land, would have been worth several $1 billion to just let it be. And in the course of the 9 years since my daughter has been born, we have an urban forest, which is less than, about 10 minutes from my home. So I'm just giving an example which is less lethal than the one that Pascal was referring to in terms of the virus-induced retreat that we've all had to endure. And if we could all, rather than leave entire parts of the world, what if we just extended the same beautiful logic that has been proposed as each one of us retreats from 10% of our footprint, right? A 10% smaller car, a 10% smaller home, a 10% smaller farmland, and then let's just see what emerges. I've lived. I did nothing for the forest except I enjoy taking walks in it now.
When you say each of us, at what level do you say to someone, I think that you need to emit more? And at what level of poverty do you stop asking people to reduce their footprint? Or do you think that it's something that everyone can do?
Yeah. No, I think the concept of retreat should be applied to everyone. And I think the concept of retreat, that there are many cultures that do value, a voluntary withdrawal from the material world. So, I don't think this is that we have to only have sort of an progressive economic notion of what retreat is. We can draw on many other sources, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be progressive. I mean, a few years ago, India introduced a campaign called "Give It Up," and it was a campaign for hashtag "Give It Up" for giving up your cooking fuel subsidy. It wasn't a regulation, it wasn't fiat. It just said, look, you're the 15% of the population that gets 90% of the cooking subsidy. So many others are not getting it. But we are not taking it away from you. We're just asking you to give it up. In less than a year, 10 million households gave it up. So I think there are different ways in which behavioral nudges can work without getting into necessarily a sort of parliamentary debate about, what is the exact progressive, economically progressive design for an intervention such as this.
I love the way that we've managed that this question has pivoted around from retreat as in a sense of giving up territory to retreat as in the sense of giving up something else, the sense of putting oneself aside for a moment and retreating as one would to a monastery or simply into oneself or to one's friends. I think that idea of a different sort of space for imagining things, a way of retreating from the pressures of some sorts of thought in order to open oneself up to others, without getting too far away from our material dialectics. I think that's actually a lovely way to think about how these sorts of conversations can go on, to take oneself out of the current conception and think about what could be different. And if it were not for the carbon footprint, I would suggest that we should all go and walk in that forest. But instead, we'll let you do it, Arunabha, and we'll experience it through your thoughts, and we'll find our own retreats to make in our own way. And Pascal, we'll wish you every good luck with the idea of trying to find out how to govern this other space, this space of the overshoot, where we also need new sorts of thinking. So with that, thank you all very much. I think there's now 15 minutes till the final plenary. I thought that was a fascinating discussion, and thank you all very much, both for participating in it as speakers and for listening, giving us your time to listen and to think your own responses. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.